Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome, and thanks so much for coming out on a beautiful evening. It's great to have all this lovely light flood in. It's great to see all of you here. It's great to have students here, whether by own choice or compulsion. Either way, you are most welcome, and it's good to see you all. And it's good to have so many community people here as well. My name is John Shevland. I serve currently as the Flannery Chair in Catholic Theology, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce what this lecture series is about and a very few words about our speaker this evening. I'm on instructions from him. Each semester, the Flannery Lecture is made possible by the Flannery Endowment, which was established in 1973 by Milo and Maud Flannery to promote the rigorous study of Catholic theology here at Gonzaga. It's a wonderful gift to stand in their tradition and to witness, to see the variety of events and speakers their endowment has made possible, just even in the few years that I've been here at Gonzaga. And these events have seeded our community with reflection and action upon the challenges and opportunities which face the Catholic Church in our time. Recent discussions have fallen on immigration, racism, and a variety of other topics. And this year's theme, which tonight includes, and a discussion as well in February will include, is the Catholic Church's response to the abuse crisis. It's also a wonderful gift to have with us this evening two adult children of Milo and Maud Flannery. Noni Comerford is here with her husband, Jim Comerford. If I could embarrass you, would you mind standing so we can all see you and appreciate you? Thank you so much for being here. As he always is, Michael Flannery is with us, which is wonderful. He's here once again with his husband, Dean Lynch. Would you please stand so we can acknowledge you? Thanks to all four of you for the many ways that you support Gonzaga through this lecture series and beyond. Thanks for your friendship over these years, and thanks also for the gift of your parents, without whom we would not quite be here this evening the way that we currently are. So thank you. At the risk of embarrassing them too, it would be unwise for me not to acknowledge in our presence this evening is a group of important and mostly unseen, but highly skilled Catholic professionals here in Spokane who serve on the Diocesan Review Board for the Diocese of Spokane and Eastern Washington. Since 2002, the U.S. Catholic Church has mandated a mostly lay review board to serve within each diocese, to review allegations and cases of abuse, and to provide lay professional advice to the local ordinary. I believe nearly all of them are here tonight. May I embarrass you and ask you to stand as well so that we can acknowledge your very good work. We as a department look forward to a dinner conversation with all of you after this event and with our speaker. Two last notes of thanks. Thanks to the Gonzaga Jesuit community who have foot the bill for a nice but not yet delivered set of appetizers and drinks just outside our hallway. You have to wait until the end for that gift to bear its full fruit. Thanks finally also to Jackie Fulton, our departmental assistant, who really makes everything go in our department. So Jackie, thank you so much. Our guest this evening is Reverend Thomas P. Doyle, and he's received many accolades. And without question, he is, in the context of the U.S. Catholic Church's dealing with the dual abuse crisis, a major player on the scene, helping the Church to see the shape, the size, the dimension of the dual abuse crisis, which has brought the U.S. Catholic Church quite possibly to its knees. However, he informs me that he does not enjoy hearing about his many accolades and accomplishments. The one pertinent fact he did wish me to convey is that he's been working on this issue for 35 years. He rightly holds an unflagging devotion to the causes of victim survivors, modeling for the church in his person what a victim's first approach looks like, what it senses, who it affiliates with, and the truths that it's willing to confess. We are very grateful in the Department of Religious Studies to host him. We're grateful for his time, and we wish to thank him for those 35 years and counting of work that he has engaged on behalf of victim survivors. Reverend Thomas Doyle's lecture this evening is entitled, "What the Sexual Abuse Phenomenon Has Done to the Catholic Church." Please welcome Father Dr. Thomas Doyle.
One of the reasons I don't like all the prolonged introductions with all of the accolades is because it sounds too much like the eulogy at a wake. And I'm still kicking and intend to stay that way. I want to first express my very sincere gratitude for the invitation to be out here with you yesterday and today. When I was on the way out here, it occurred to me that I'm probably going to walk away, taking away with me more than what I gave, and that's already come true. My luncheon today with some of the faculty and students and the colloquium with the faculty later on, I listened and heard things that have been incredibly helpful to me. I've been immersed in this issue deeply for 35 years. No matter where I've been, and I was a number of years as an officer and chaplain in the Air Force, I was still immersed in it. So I need to hear and to see the effects and the thoughts and the response of people who haven't been as deeply involved as I have, or as deeply immersed. So I've learned a lot, I've heard a lot, and it has been really incredibly helpful to me. I speak tonight from, and I'm going to say this not out of pride or arrogance, but just so you have a little idea where I'm coming from. I've been involved in this issue since it basically surfaced in this era back in 1985, 84 and 85. And I've been involved in it in several countries other than the United States, in Europe, Australia, in a number of ways, as an expert, as a consultant. The most important thing that I've done, however, for the past number of years has been my ability and privilege to interact with the victims, young and old, and to listen to them and to hold their hands and to walk with them sometimes as they tried to find their way, not only with regard to the issue of faith and belief, but just in general. And that, as I said, is the most important thing that I've done, bar none. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is, I titled the thing, Yesterday, Today, and the Tomorrows. This is some of my reflections, some of my experience. And the surge of interest we've seen in the phenomenon of sexual violation of the vulnerable by Catholic clerics and religious is due in large part, the surge of recent interest, to two unique and history-making events. One is the laicization and the banishment of former Cardinal Ted McCarrick. And the second is the publication of the extensive report of the grand jury in the state of Pennsylvania, which, contrary to the opinion of a well-known Catholic journalist, is not grossly misleading, irresponsible, inaccurate, or unjust. It's just the opposite of all four. The sexual violation by clerics and religious of all ranks and of both genders has existed in the institutional church throughout its history. The oldest prohibition is found in the writing called the Didache, the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, which dates from approximately 98 AD. And it says in there simply that men shall not sexually violate young boys. This dates from the end of the first century, and from that period on, the most recent official enactment, is May of 2019, the publication of a set of procedural rules by Pope Francis. In between those two dates, there were hundreds of pronouncements, official pronouncements by popes, bishops, groups of bishops, councils, trying to deal with the issue of sexual violation and the violation in the inappropriate sexual actions of the clerics. This era that we're in now began in 1983 and has continued. It's been radically different, however, than any other era when sexual abuse or sexual violation has reared its head and become a publicly known phenomenon in the Catholic Church. It gradually emerged as a horrific reality that no longer is hidden, but it's been exposed in Catholic communities throughout the world, with the few cases in 84, 85, coming from Louisiana, Minnesota, and Rhode Island, the first states where in dioceses these issues were discovered. John Paul II's early attempts to blame the American church and then the English-speaking churches would be seen as simply ludicrous if they did not mask a very active denial that only succeeded in enabling bishops and fueling the intense adversarial nature of this ever-increasing and spreading reality. So today we're in the midst of a process of revelation of the tragic and destructive dark side of the institutional Catholic Church. And I'm not referring, when I use the term dark side, to what I consider to be irrelevant cop-outs by those who blame it all on the influence of Satan or the devil. That's an attempt to avoid accountability and responsibility. Some have compared this phenomenon to the state of the church that produced the Reformation. But in truth, it's far worse. In spite of some attempts to explain it by pointing to a rejection of traditional moral theology, or the fallout from the social and the sexual turbulence of the 60s, these theories and others like them are only very weak distractions. The existence of sexual abuse, in truth, is a plague and the evidence of a profound contradiction that reaches to the fundamental core of the institutional Catholic Church. And the contradiction is this, and it's something that for 35 years of my involvement, I still find impossible to wrap my brain around it. On the one side, we have the church, described as the mystical body of Christ, the people of God, the source of our earthly happiness and the gateway to our eternal happiness. And at the same time, it's a church that has given us one of history's most stringent and restrictive codes of sexual conduct, and taught us that even the slightest of violations can result in eternal damnation. This is the message we've received from the clerical leaders of the church. And at the same time, this church that has promised us salvation, earthly happiness, and tranquility if we obey the rules, has committed and systematically enabled the commission of acts against the most vulnerable in our midst, acts that are deemed by most, if not all societies, as the most horrific and disgusting that can be perpetrated on another human being. And I'm referring, as you know, to the sexual violation of children, of minors, and of adults. But the focus has been on children who have been the least able to defend themselves the least able to process and understand this horrific violation, and the ones who have carried the damage and the scars into their adult life, hoping and praying and wondering if there was ever going to be any relief. The horror is compounded when we realize that the damage that's been inflicted on the victims surpasses the harm that's done to their bodies, to their souls, to their emotions. And it's the profound spiritual damage that can only be described as the murder of the soul. I can't tell you how many men and women I have had the privilege of listening to, talking to, who have said, we never really realized what we had until it was taken from us. And there's no way we can get it back. And that is so tragic, to listen and see people that have believed that that part of their being is gone forever. This is the contradiction that we've lived with. It's a chasm between the ideals of the Christian life and the betrayal of these ideals by those whom we have been taught to believe are Christ's visible ministers to us. And if we step back and ponder the totality of what I've just described, the totality of what's before us, it defies description, it defies comprehension. Since 1983, the dynamic of this dark epidemic has radically changed. The length, the breadth, and the depth has slowly and painfully unfolded from being covered by a thick blanket of industrial strength secrecy to a scandalous dimension of the church that defies every Christian principle. And although popes and bishops have asked the lay members to fast, to do penance, to pray for forgiveness, to contribute to paying the costs of this because it's all our responsibility, these entreaties are clearly misplaced because those who have opened the gates to the dark side have not been the laity, but it's been the hierarchy who we believe and have been taught have been placed over us by the Lord himself. Over the past 30 years, there have been dozens of studies and reports that have been done throughout the world. And the common element that these have looked for is the causality. And the common element in the causality has been the role of the hierarchy and the inadequacy of their response. Hard to swallow for some, but it's reality. The collective efforts, and here I not only include the bishops, but also the former Bishop of Rome, John Paul II, to deny, to minimize, to shift the blame and the cause have failed colossally. It can't be denied, it cannot be minimized, and the blame cannot be shifted. Parallel to this steady and ever more horrific and horrifying stories of violation and hierarchical mendacity have been the fumbling attempts of the institutional church to figure out just how to manage this nightmare. In every other era, when the scourge of sexual violation has managed to surface in the life of the church, and there have been other times in the 2,000-year history when it has become publicly known. In every other era, it has been the popes and the bishops who have controlled the attempts to cope with it, and it is they who have done so exclusively by means of discipline of the offending clerics or monks. And perhaps this was the only tools they knew at that time. But today the situation is radically different. The hierarchy's attempts have failed. The system cannot fix itself. And almost from the beginning, the victims have realized that waiting for the institutional church to respond to them in a compassionate, supportive way, and to look at itself to try to find realistic explanations have been a waste of time. Unlike any other destructive challenge the institutional church has faced, this time, the victims and the laity have emerged as the leaders and as the force for both enlightenment and change. And that My comparison is like driving a bulldozer up to try to move Mount Everest. But we've succeeded. We're moving it, inch by inch, slowly and sometimes invisibly, but it's moving. The scourge of sexual violation and its systemic enabling, cover-up, and the complex web of untruths has revealed a harsh reality that has afflicted the people of God for centuries. First, sexual violation and other forms of corruption are deeply entrenched in the clerical culture, a culture that protects the clerics rather than the victims. Who are the clerics? Priests, bishops, cardinals, popes. Second, the constant obsession of the hierarchy with protecting its image, its stature, its power, at the expense of the victims has had the opposite effect. And it has in fact produced an erosion of the trust and the respect that they have depended on. This reality has revealed a much different church than that of Lumen Gentium, of Mystici Corporis, of the Catechism, the Code of Canon Law. And contrast, if you've read, as I did very recently for the first time in years, Lumen Gentium, the constitutional, the dogmatic constitution on the nature of the church from Vatican II. You contrast the soaring mystical rhetoric in Lumen Gentium, or even Mystici Corporis of Pius XII, with the undeniable behavior of the institution over the past 3 decades that we have seen. And it's a contrast that's impossible to not only swallow, but to comprehend. The history of sexual abuse, denial, and cover-up has been embedded in the clerical culture that has not only protected it, but enabled it, and this culture is no longer capable of hiding, controlling, minimizing, or eradicating it. Nor is it capable of continuing to sustain the myth of clerical superiority based on the magical thinking about the nature of sacred orders. This complex phenomenon is far more than the physical violation of minors by clerics and the fumbling response of church leadership. People on all levels of the institutional church have by now realized that this phenomenon is profoundly destructive and toxic. And I use the word phenomenon intentionally because it's bigger than a crisis, it's bigger than a problem, it's not just a temporary or a transcendent issue, it's something that's deeply embedded in the very fiber of the institution itself. So we've realized that this phenomenon is profoundly destructive and toxic, and it's also prophetic in a kind of a schizophrenic way. There have been multiple efforts at explaining, understanding, and reacting to it. Some are constructive and worthwhile, while others are ridiculous fluff. But as yet, there has been no organized and church-supported and sponsored effort to take the risk of fearlessly looking into and peeling back the many layers of causality that are at the bottom of these essential questions. There are 3. The first, why has the institutional church attracted a significant number of men who are emotionally and sexually immature and often psychosexually disturbed? And what has the clerical culture done to enable this condition? The second, why have the ordained pastors been incapable of comprehending the profound depth of spiritual damage done to their victims, their loved ones, and the entire Christian community, and equally incapable of finding effective paths to healing? And finally, why has there been such obsessive concern for the welfare of the clerical caste? And why has there been an inability to recognize that those who've been violated are the church as well? Not a byproduct, not satellites, but core members of the people of God. And in spite of these seemingly the seemingly nonstop assurances of a new age of individual and institutional honesty, the current phrase is transparency, in spite of these assurances, there are far too many members of the hierarchy who persist in acting in a contradictory manner by continuing to treat victims and survivors as things and not people, and by resisting the efforts of both law enforcement and government and judicial agencies from uncovering the full extent of the hierarchy's responsibility. And I will tell you that the progress that has been made in uncovering this issue and in bringing solace and peace and help to the victims has primarily been in the arena of the civil courts of this country, because that is a power that the institutional church has not been able to harness. And that now is the same thing that's happening in other countries. And that is exposing to us the gap between what we call the people of God and the institution that's trying to run it. We don't have to look too far for the examples of the lack of responsibility. First is the failure of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Children, and that failure is due primarily to the subversive actions of some of the members of the Roman Curia, who have done everything they could at every turn to sabotage and torpedo the well-intentioned and good work of the members of the Commission. Second is the obstructionist tactics of numerous bishops and their attorneys and their unwillingness to cooperate with states' attorneys general and other state authorities who are looking into the churches themselves to find the extent of the issue. Two examples are the bishops of Colorado and California, and there are others. Third is the destructive action of bishops and their attorneys toward too many victims who have chosen to seek relief in the civil courts. All the words about compassion and love and care and concern, and we're really concerned, those fall flat as soon as a victim goes to court. Then they become the enemy. And the attorneys who work for the church do everything they can in too many cases to bury these people, to pound them into the ground. And the excuse given is, well, that's the legal profession. Wait a minute, Bishop, you're the one that runs these guys. You pay them, you hire them, you can tell them to back off. But that is not done. Finally, the creation of campaigns to block any type of legislative reform that would benefit not only Catholic victims, but all victims of any type of institution, victims of any type of sexual violation. The campaigns to block this by the expenditure of millions of dollars to hire lobbyists and by the spread of nonsensical propaganda that this is all a campaign to destroy the Catholic Church. And in at least two states, Colorado and Pennsylvania, these campaigns have been mixed in, led by the bishop, campaigns to destroy the reputations of the lawmakers who supported the legislation. The last number I heard was at least $10 million has been expended to hire lobbyists. And the only institutions that are actively in opposition of legislative change for statutes of limitation and mandatory reporting, the predominant one has been the Roman Catholic bishops and their state Catholic conferences. Secondly, to some extent, the insurance industry, and now the Boy Scouts have joined in. All with a great deal to lose, by the way, because what will come out, if more people are allowed to go to court, is more truth. Now, all of this tells us that the compulsive drive to protect the institution and to prevent full disclosure of the depth and the expanse of the corruption is still dominant. Discounting victims for the good of the church violates the true nature of the people of God in favor of the preservation of power of the hierarchical aristocracy. And the real concern is not the good of the church, it's the security of the governing elite. And the hierarchy and those who support the traditional monarchical model of the church must be confronted with this question. Why has clerical identity and the illusion of power taken precedence over some very basic Christian principles, but especially over Christ's dire warning to those who would harm the little ones? I posed that question to a bishop a number of years ago about harming the little ones, and he said to me, that's not relevant in this issue. One dimension of this response is rooted in the institutional narcissism that infects the clerical world and is rooted in the definition of the church that is essential to support and sustain what we have been led to believe is the traditional theology of the episcopacy and the meaning of the priesthood. Definitions that are founded supposedly on the will of Christ himself. There have been recent conferences in the United States and in England that have examined the relationship of clericalism to the sexual abuse phenomenon. They've acknowledged what has been painfully obvious, that the history of sexual abuse, denial, and cover-up has been embedded in the clerical culture that not only protected, but enabled it. And the power of this culture cannot be underestimated. It's hypocritical for clerics, or anyone for that matter, to criticize and condemn clericalism while at the same time refusing to take the courageous step of examining the dogmas, the laws, and the practices that continue to support it. It didn't come up there by itself. It just didn't pop into existence. It is supported by issues that are deeply rooted in the church itself. It has become politically correct for some cardinals and bishops to issue statements and make critical noises about the negative effects of clericalism, yet the irony and their lack of credibility is that they are part of the social structure that needs clericalism to survive. It's not beneficial to talk about it endlessly. Something must be done. The institutional church and the people of God are defined as one and the same primarily because of the stiff opposition to the concept of the church as people of God by the deeply entrenched opposition of the heads of several Vatican congregations during Vatican II. Their objections are summed up in one word: power. In reality, the two are not the same. The institutional church is a stratified society with a minuscule minority who make up the aristocracy that has complete power over the vast majority. There are, give or take, 1,079,000,000 Catholics in the world. They are governed by approximately 3,000 persons. An aristocracy that is exclusively patriarchal, celibate, male, and ordained, none of whom have ever been parents or involved in an intimate, loving relationship. This, according to canon law, is the way God wants it to be. Now, Pope Pius X articulated this in unequivocal terms in a 1906 encyclical. Quote, "It follows that the church is essentially an unequal society. That is, a society comprising two categories of persons, the pastors, the bishops, and the flock, you, us, those who occupy a rank in the different degrees of the hierarchy and the multitude of the faithful. So distinct are these categories that with the pastoral body only rests the necessary right and authority for promoting the end of the society and directing all of its members toward that end. The one duty of the multitude is to allow themselves to be led and, like a docile flock, to follow the pastors." Now, you may recoil at those words, but listen to these. They come from a different source. The laity should, as all Christians, promptly accept in Christian obedience the decisions of their spiritual shepherds, since they are representatives of Christ as well as teachers and rulers of the church. Lumen Gentium, paragraph 37. Second Vatican Council, 1963. Clericalism is without doubt a deadly virus that has infected the entire people of God, and has been a major causal factor in the sexual abuse phenomenon. The existence and the tenacity of clericalism is rooted in the official theology of the priesthood, much of which is based on magical thinking, and in the persistent belief that the monarchical governmental structure that has to be protected at all costs is the only option, even though there is no concrete and credible evidence to support that conclusion. But talking about it and condemning it is one thing, and getting rid of it and changing it is quite another. The horrific history of sexual violation and the systemic destructive response are now out in the open. It is acknowledged what the hierarchy in most instances does not want to face, that the people of God and the hierarchical governmental structure are not one and the same. And the hierarchical system we have lived with can hardly be blamed on Christ as its author. The official church documents and the Code of Canon Law are filled with analogies to shepherds, to sheep, the flocks, and all are ordered to the concept of the church as primarily pastoral in nature. And if we look closely at the pattern and practice of official pastoral care, we see that it is subordinate and supportive of the structures that are the root of the problem. It's also subordinate to theological orthodoxy, to obedience to the law, and to the moral norms and obedience to the bishops. So what exactly is pastoral care? I think the stark poverty of the concept is epitomized in Pope Benedict's letter to the people of Ireland in 2010, which he wrote in response to the blistering report of the Murphy Commission, which was published in Dublin, November 26, 2009. Quote, "But it is in the church that you will find Jesus Christ. Seek a personal relationship with him and within the communion of his church, and he will never betray your trust. Only decisive action carried out with complete honesty will restore the respect and goodwill of the Irish people toward the church to which we have consecrated our lives." Now, I'm sure he meant every word of that from deeply inside. And I respect him for that conviction, because that's the only world he has ever known. But he's asking the victims of the clergy who violated their bodies and their souls while they were active, devout believers in this institutional church to go back to the same church and expect to be healed. They are told that the church is not errant priests or dishonest bishops. The office is not the person who holds it. But it's a long stretch to ask those who have been harmed to accept that excuse, because the church is the people, and the offices are the men who are the incumbents. They make the offices what they are. So Benedict goes on to ask them to cooperate in the rebuilding and renewal of our beloved church. But fixing the institutional church is not even close to the agenda of most of the survivors, nor it is on the agenda of many who have supported them, including plenty of lay people, clergy, and religious. Fixing to this point has meant administrative and bureaucratic responses, some of which are a definite step in a good direction, but all of which steer clear of challenging the system itself and moving beyond review boards, independent compensation and reconciliation programs, liturgical penance services, and the like. All of these are managed by the system that remains threatened, and all have been used by the system, the hierarchical system, for public relations benefit to one degree or another. I believe what most lay people don't know is that the Dallas meeting in 2002 that took place in reaction to the explosions in Boston in January 2002 was primarily organized by a public relations firm from New York named L.L. Binder, helping the bishops figure out what they're supposed to do to look like bishops. And there's something wrong with that picture. From my own experience in walking with victims in search of spiritual healing, and the experience of my own, oftentimes very painful journey, I've learned that the healing is a long and even a lifetime process. It begins with the hard work of recognizing and dispelling the toxic and magical thinking about the nature of the priesthood, the nature of the institutional church, and ultimately the very existence of the image of God that we are asked to believe in and trust. For many, the healing only begins when we've effectively distanced ourselves from the source of the betrayal, the pain, and the devastation to our souls. Then we can deal with the blinding anger, the profound loss of trust, and the countless questions that keep coming up in an effort to sort out and wrap our minds around the collapse of an entire belief system. For many of us, and by us I mean us, including the countless formerly obedient, devout victims, our belief system starts with what we are taught by the clerics and religious. Much of the anger and pain that follows upon the betrayal is fueled by the collapse of the complex world of belief and Catholic culture that is grounded in this hierarchical systematic church. We are told that the bishops are the official teachers of God's message for us. But as more than one victim has asked me, and as I have asked myself, if they've lied systematically about the violation of children, what else have they lied about? So renewing or repairing the church is not the goal of the survivors of clerical violence and betrayal. And Pope Benedict, God bless him, is far removed from reality, I think, when he speaks and asks the victims to return to this institution for reconciliation and healing. The primary goal should be to find out why this tragedy has been so deeply embedded in the church. And this means going far deeper than looking at the immediate levels of causality and pointing the fingers of blame at bishops, popes, cardinals, priests. Doing more than that, it means digging deeply. It means leaving the John Jay Studies concept, causes and context, with its attempt at blaming the social and moral upheaval of the 60s in the dust. It means cessation of casting about to shift the blame elsewhere, to the devil, to materialism, to secularism, to relativism, to any other ism. It means not allowing the administrative and the canonical solutions to distract us into believing that the hallucination that this system that has created and sustained this plague for centuries can now fix it, while at the same time saving the fundamental social and governmental clerical structure. St. Thomas said, you cannot be and not be at the same time under the same circumstances. You can't be two things at once. The system cannot fix itself and at the same time continue to be what it has been. And all of this means going beyond talking about clericalism to digging into the deep historical, philosophical, anthropological, and theological roots of the core issues that have played the major role in sustaining the history of sexual violence and hierarchical betrayal. And once the answers start to emerge, and the inevitable threats to the clerical and hierarchical status quo are faced, but not allowed to once again derail the search for truth, only then will we begin to gain mastery over the dark side. For those who still hope to find their true spiritual home in the community of Catholic believers, it may well be the moment to embrace the truly foundational concept of church as people of God and give it a chance, and it might just work. Thank you.
Tom has been gracious enough to take some questions and engage our community in conversation. As you maybe consider what you might want to ask, let me suggest that maybe we use the center aisle. I'll be down there in a moment, and folks who would like to pose a question, engage our friend in conversation can do so. I would just ask that you maybe introduce yourself and be sure that you're posing a question. So that we can get a response and exchange. As you do that, it might be helpful as well to realize that the U.S. Catholic Church has really changed in a number of ways the last several years. One way to track that information is from the new website, preventionusccb.org. preventionusccb.org. And some of the better practices alive in the church today can be seen at the Center for Child Protection in Rome, the Gregorian Jesuit University, the CCP, Center for Child Protection in Rome. So if anyone would like to pose a question for our guest, perhaps use the center aisle here.
Dead silence. But I don't hear anybody snoring, so I'm appreciative of that.
I may not go to heaven now.
Oh.
I am a person who was sued for defamation for reporting an ordained Protestant, because in my childhood I was a Catholic and I come from a Catholic family, and I tried to find another source of spiritual support in the military and in other places I've been. So my question is the church or some other body, we have a law school over here, providing any kind of legal education and or legal support to the church and to the victims and to the families of the victims?
My answer to that is, in some areas, the answer is yes, and I can't give you a lot of specific details about support for victims. There's much less for families because there's been much less of a realization of the pain that the families have encountered. And let me just say as an aside, I guess, some of the most anguished, gut-wrenching moments in my life have been when I've sat with mothers and fathers and listened to them as they've described to me what it was like for them when they first found out their little boy or their little girl was violated sexually, and then when they found out it was a priest. The church, in the broad sense, the people of God, yes, are providing and organizing different ways, to provide support, assistance, advice, especially support for victims of sexual abuse. And I think some dioceses are recruiting groups of lay people to do the same thing, which has been, from what I understand, in some cases successful, in some cases not. But at least it's being done.
As an act of repentance and as a corrective and structural intervention, when will the Catholic Church ordain women?
Well, I got to be honest and tell you, I don't know, because I'm not involved anymore in that dimension. I think under the present circumstances, as long as the patriarchal, hierarchical system is in power, the answer is going to be a long time. Circumstances where they're running out of priests don't seem to be phasing the upper levels of authority. But you know, one thing that to me is pretty important. It's changing the focus of the concept of ordination from priests, where the main thing you do is do sacraments, the liturgical, to being pastoral ministers is crucially important. I was in the Air Force for almost 2 decades, and the most satisfying part of that was the pastoral dimension, because we, the chaplains, were right there on the front lines. We were with the people, and we all looked alike. That's what was wonderful about it. Everybody looked alike. We had the same uniforms. We were subject to the same discipline, the same authority. And when we had to deploy, we all had to sleep on the ground in cold, knapsacks, that kind of thing. So I think the concept itself needs to be really brutally but truthfully explored. That's a good question, though. And I have to tell you, I think that in that regard, if that were an issue, if that were a reality in the church, and there were women clerics and wives of priests, a lot of this wouldn't be happening. A lot of it wouldn't be happening.
Father Tom, I'm curious how you got into this field initially.
How I got into doing this?
Topic. Mm-hmm.
I was in the Vatican Embassy in Washington, D.C., and I was a loyal son of the system, believe me. Very much so. And I was simply asked by my boss, the Archbishop, who was the Vatican ambassador, called a nuncio, to follow the progress of a case that was reported to us from Louisiana, where they sent us a letter and said that one of our priests has sexually abused a bunch of children, and we've settled with 6 families who have promised total confidentiality, and we've paid them off. So there's nothing to worry about. Everything's under control. Don't worry about a thing. This is just for your information only. So I filed a letter, and I wrote the guy a response, and my boss signed it. 3 or 4 days later, we get another letter that says basically, never mind, one couple pulled out. They got a lawyer, and they're suing the priest, the vicar general, the bishop, you, the papal ambassador, and the pope. That's when I got involved. And I really got involved when I met the victims, these little 10 and 12-year-old boys, for the first time. My life was changed forever after that. Looking at this one little boy, 10 years old, he'd been one of the victims. He was the son of this one couple. He'd been sexually violated by Gilbert Gautier, the priest. And it was a violent violation, violent. And looking at him, it was like an empty shell. And I'll never forget that haunted look in that little boy's face. And I think about that, and the response of another bishop many years ago to the fact that one priest in his diocese had sexually abused about 30, 40 kids. And he was questioned about that in a deposition. And his response was, "Little boys heal." One of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. They don't heal. Nor do little girls. Nor do big boys and big girls when they're violated that way.
Father Doyle, you indicated that the systemic corruption is so deep in the church that we need to go deeper in order to find the healing, that we need to look at philosophy, anthropology, theology. My question is, do you think that we need to really get to the point where we are questioning and looking at our scriptural interpretations, our apostolic traditions, and how we can actually really change something there?
Yes.
The way that we see it.
I do. I firmly believe that. I firmly believe that. I do not believe that it was God's will that the Catholic Church have a hierarchical governmental system, because that never came into the picture until the era of Constantine, when the church, the believers, the followers of Christ, which was about as loosely organized as you could get, were recognized as a force by the emperor, because he saw votes, I guess, a political, it was a political move. And the only known type of government at the time was like monarchical, hierarchical. So the myth that one day Jesus appeared to St. Peter and said, "This is what I want," is just that. It's a myth. And the whole issue of the priesthood, the issue of the question of ontological change, unfortunately, is believed to be it's concretized. It's a real something that's happening rather than a metaphor. Now, I was ordained, and the only thing that I wanted once I got out of that ordination ceremony, the only thing different was I needed a cigarette. And I think what happened at the ordination didn't make me what I was. It was learning as I went on and experiencing what it meant to be a pastoral minister, to be a priest. Good question. Answer, yes, I think so.
Hi there, my name is Ronnie. I'm a junior at Gonzaga. And my question is specifically in regards to safety plans that a lot of Jesuit priests are put on that are allegedly abusive of a lot of kids. So my question is, what are your thoughts on safety plans, and what do you think it does for an institution to be able to have those put in place to make it look like something is being done when obviously issues aren't being addressed? First you expose the hypocrisy, and then you have to do something about it. And the safety plans of a lot of organizations are paper only. I've seen situations where men were questioned. They said, "Well, you're listed as the monitor of Father so-and-so." And the guy said, "I never knew that. Nobody told me." So it's a well-placed question, and it's an important issue for the safety of people, because unfortunately, the compulsion to abuse sexually doesn't rest with one or two victims. Most often it expands, and the myth that it only happened once is a myth. Especially if it's a serious psychosexual disorder, which will have that high level of compulsion for decades, more than most men experience sexual compulsion. It goes way beyond. Is that an adequate answer to your question? Because if it's not adequate, tell me.
Other questions, comments? Okay, several. We'll come around.
Oh, excuse me. I just have a question. From your experience, is there such a thing as a celibate priest?
Yes, there is. And the reason I say that is I've met some very healthy men who I believe had the gift. Unfortunately, celibacy is imposed on you if you want to be a Catholic priest, unless you're an Anglican priest and you want to switch over, or Eastern Rite. It's imposed. And we were told it's a gift, that God will take care of it, and after you're ordained or after you take vows, you don't have to worry about any issues of temptations or desire and so on. And that's a real fairy tale, believe me. But I think one of my dearest and closest friends was a man named Richard Sipe. Dick Sipe was a Benedictine monk, priest, psychologist who did a longitudinal study of 2,600 priests on the issue of celibacy. He wrote a book and published it in 1991, I believe, called The Secret World. And his conclusions, based on his study, were that a small minority actually have the gift of true celibacy, that many don't, and that the ideal that every priest, or 98%, practice celibacy on a regular basis is untrue. It's simply not provable. It's not there.
How strongly do you feel that the church should encourage or come to a conclusion of marriage?
Married priests? They should do it tomorrow. One of the excuses have been, well, we as celibate priests are totally dedicated to the people and all this sort of thing, and we don't have time for spouses and kids. We can't get involved in that because we have to be totally dedicated. I was a chaplain in the Air Force for a number of years, and I served side by side with chaplains of other denominations, Jewish, Muslim, Protestant, and Orthodox, all of whom were married.
And some of the married ones were women chaplains, some were men. They were just as dedicated, just as filled with God's love as any priest I ever met. So that's a fairy tale. It's another myth. And I can tell you from my own experience that the fact that I wasn't married all the years I was in active ministry wasn't what motivated me. It was the example of others. I guess if I'd had a spouse and children, I probably would have been a much better priest. Much better priest. I'll tell you a little story. I live alone in Northern Virginia. And about 14 years ago, I got out of the Air Force and I was going to buy a house. I had to have a place to live. And my niece at the time, who was 28, 29, was doing an internship in Washington, so she was going to be living with me. And this young girl that I knew, who at the time just had a baby, the baby was 4 months old, and I'd known this girl since she was maybe 7 or 8, and she needed a place to go, to stay. And so I said, we were at a family dinner, and this is like my own family. I said, I'm buying a house, and I'll make sure I get a place big enough for you and Phineas, your little baby. So you can stay there as long as you need. Well, it's like the man who came to dinner. That lasted 14 years. But I had an unbelievable blessing being in that home as that little boy went from 4 months to 14 years old, and watching that and learning, and I bonded with him. He calls me his grunkle, which is his word for a grandfather-uncle combination. And I always said, after the first month or so, I said, every Catholic cleric ought to be forced to spend a week with a single mother with an infant. Because my moment of truth came one day when she knocked on my bedroom door at 6 in the morning and she said, Tom, I got the flu real bad. Can you take care of Phineas? If I try changing him, I'm going to vomit all over him. So I went into panic mode level 4. I didn't know what to do. So I went in his bedroom, and he's there, he's awake, and he had to be changed and cleaned up. Now, little kids, as you all know, don't come with a manual. So I didn't know what to do. So I just kind of figured, well, this is what you do. And she told me after, she didn't do too bad for the first time. But being there for that 1 week and then carrying on taught me immensely about more than I could even express. And it was one of the most wonderful blessings I've ever had. Now, if I'd have had that all the years I was in active ministry, I could have been a much more effective priest in dealing with families, with problems, and so on. I think the last person that people should go to for marriage counseling is a celibate priest. Unless he's trained.
Hi, my name's Josephine Orlando. I'm a sophomore here at Gonzaga University. I wanted to ask you a little bit about what steps you've taken to help maintain your faith in the Catholic Church. I was raised Catholic. Both my parents work at Jesuit universities, so the Catholic Church has been a big part of my life. And I know that during the only 20 years I've been alive, I haven't been able to experience the extent of, fortunately, of this crisis, this phenomenon. But it has definitely taken a toll on my relationship with the Catholic Church, even if I haven't experienced those experiences that so many other people my age have. And luckily for me, it's been support at Gonzaga University through the religious department and places I found on campus that has helped me try to find new avenues to try to explore the Catholic faith. But it's put a new kind of pressure on how I experience some leaders in my own church back at home in Seattle. And I just want to know, through everything you've experienced, through all the stories you've heard, how have you maintained this trust in this extremely powerful institution?
That's a really good question, and I appreciate it, your honesty. And I'll be honest, I haven't maintained that trust. It's gone.
I had to shift, as we used to say in the military, my target sets as to what I believed in and why I believed in it. I went through a long, fairly painful self-discerning process. I had help in doing that with two people who were very close to me. One was a physician who's unfortunately now deceased, and the other is a retired Methodist pastor who's now 92 and still is a very dear friend of mine. And I was able to discuss with him and share with him the depth of my own disappointment and anger and fear. And I found that I had to examine. I actually went back and opened up some of the theology books I had when I was in theology back in the 60s to re-examine what I thought I believed. And I had to ask myself the key issues. What does belief mean? What do I believe in? What do I know is true? What do I hope is true? And when I ended up, there wasn't much there, but what was there was pretty core. And I think the core issue was the concept of a higher power that's essentially undifferentiated. I no longer could believe in the image of God that we had been taught, the guy with the beard on the throne that has to be constantly adulated, that gets angry if you do something wrong, especially if you have sex out of turn, and you're going to get zapped and all this nonsense. I just fired him. I said, I can't deal with this. I can no longer believe in this. It's ludicrous. So I'm left with what? And so I started kind of putting things together again with the help of some others, and ended up with really accepting, and I'm also, I have to say in honesty, in a 12-step program. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've been sober 28 years. And as we say, my name is Tom and I'm an alcoholic. That more than anything has helped me, because that's when I discovered what spirituality was. And that's where I think I really encountered what the church probably was at the very beginning, because we sit around those rooms and we're all equal. And we can't condemn each other because one's worse than the next. And you learn that all you do when somebody falls off is help them stand up again. And you never criticize, you always encourage. That more than anything else has been the core of my belief system. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Daniela, and I'm a senior here. And we've been talking about this in Dr. Shevlin's class for the last couple of weeks. But I was thinking about this phenomena in, I guess, in terms of a betrayal of trust. And I think that in that conversation, we have to recognize that the Catholic Church has done two primary things in my analysis when it comes to trust. And that's take advantage of the children's trust in the church, and then also take advantage of adults' trust in the church, that the church will do the right thing. So I think that the most heartbreaking aspect of this phenomenon to me is that it depends on the goodwill or the good nature of children and the willful ignorance of adults. So I'm trying to figure out how you could flip that so that it would have to necessarily depend on the good nature of adults and the innocence, protecting the innocence of children.
That's really, that's a profound question. And you know, it really is. The goodwill and innocence of children, who some don't even know what's been happening to them when it's happened, but they know something's wrong. How to turn that around, and I think it's only a question of time. And one of the reasons the numbers have dropped off so drastically isn't because of programs or policies or protocols. It's simply because of what has happened. You know, Catholic parents now do not allow their children to be alone with clerics. The day is gone where you can go into the family and say, can I take Charlie here with me on a camping trip over the weekend? That doesn't happen. It's not going to ever happen again. And I think a lot of it has to do with the clergy have to rebuild the trust, and that's going to take a long, long time and a lot of effort and a lot of changing of the image. One of my dearest friends is a man named Jeff Robinson. He's a bishop in Australia. And Jeff was assigned by the Australian bishops to be their liaison with the victims of sexual abuse. And I knew him before as a canon lawyer, way in the back in the dark ages before he was a bishop. And what he did, rather than treat it as an administrative task, he went about visiting with them, getting to know them, talking with them, talking to their parents, and it nearly broke him. But it had a profound impact on his consciousness of his image. And he said, I can never again wear blacks because I know the impact it has. So that kind of sensitivity about some of the small things we took for granted that have such a profound impact. But how to switch that around, the total trust of parents to allow this to happen, and the fear that was in them if they didn't allow it to happen. The discovery of the reality of that's part of what I think I'm all about, is digging so deep that we can expose what these causes are and help people learn to divest themselves of some of these toxic beliefs. That if we insult a priest, something bad's going to happen to us or my family, either in this life or the next life. That's a belief that's not uncommon. And the little children that are harmed so grievously, many of them, God knows what happens as they go through life. I've seen so many and seen them as adults. And I don't even know how to explain it or where to start when it comes to holding their hands and helping them to try to find healing. But as I said, really insightful question that in my soul brings a lot of sadness.
Hello, I'm with this nice gentleman here. He's asked me to actually deliver a question to you. So if we're thinking about how this institution might start to look at its the source of this phenomena and those who are perpetuating the problem, do they have internal networks where they can go and speak? Do they have psychologists that they can talk to? Is there any way internally for the priest, the bishop, the pastor to come forward with what's going on, to seek help, to say, hey, I can't control this? Do they have internal mechanisms to prevent the perpetuation of this?
You mean the individual? Like if a guy says, I can't control my sexual urges, or are you talking in general?
I'm saying within actually the church,
The system.
within the system.
I think within the hierarchical dimension, no. I don't know of anything that exists where they actually sit around and can delve into this, into the effects it's having on them. And I know from what John has said and what I've heard from others, there's this feeling that we're victims. They're picking on us a lot now because, everybody's out to get the bishops, and it's really not our fault. Well, I'm sorry, fellas, but it is. And there's got to be an acceptance of what you've done.
And honesty.
As I said, I'm in recovery. I can't say that I did a lot of crazy stuff when I was drinking. I can't blame my disease. I can only say that might be partially responsible, but I am responsible. I am accountable for what I've done. And I think that's part of the issue, that there isn't any internal. Several years ago, the Vatican refused to allow a number of bishops, this is more than several years ago, to attend these renewal programs they had in Rome for people who needed to get updated after the Vatican Council. And their excuse was, the bishops don't need this because they're the teachers. It's like it's infused knowledge. Where's it come from, A bird sat on my head. So I don't know of any. That would be a revolutionary move forward, to have something like that. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. So actually, I have a similar question related to that in terms of the internal mechanism. So for example, in the Buddhist tradition, Buddhist monks and nuns, they are human beings too. So there's a particular type of contemplation practice for them. For example, to look at the corpse, to help them to overcome the desire for human's body. And I noticed that such contemplation, for example, does not exist in Ignatius' spiritual exercises. And as you know, that is a very important meditation guidebook for Jesuit tradition. So now my question is that, since that is not mentioned in the spiritual exercises, what kind of contemplation practices in the Jesuit tradition will help the priest to overcome that sexual desire? Because that is just part of human nature. What kind of mechanism can help them to transform that kind of mentality? Thank you.
First thing I got to admit to you is I don't know much about the Jesuit traditions because I'm not a Jesuit, never have been. I do believe in contemplation. I believe in meditation. I'm not sure if there's any one solid, tried, true ability or way to totally control sexual desire and sexual compulsion. If it's dysfunctional, you can't just meditate. It just takes a lot more for somebody who's psychosexually disturbed. The pedophiles, for example, I know clinically have a level of compulsion to act out sexually that's 40 times stronger than the normal compulsion for an ordinary male at the height of his sexuality. 40 times. And that lasts into the 80s and beyond. So it's a unique psychosexual, physical phenomenon. Just the ordinary, that's a good question. As I said, I'd be glad to give you an intelligent answer, but if I gave you an answer, it wouldn't be very intelligent.
Perhaps just one final question.
Hello, my name is Cecilia Elias. My husband and I have been cradle Catholics. So we have 4 children, and in the 1980s it came to light that one of the clergy had sexually abused our 9-year-old. The way we found out about this was he tried to sexually abuse our 13-year-old, who then told us, and so that's how it was all came to light. We immediately went to the police because that's a crime, so we went to the police. This happened in Los Angeles. We were completely ostracized from our church where we had been in that particular parish for 10 years. We were told by the pastor that we better make sure that it didn't get out because we could be sued by all these people. We were moving at the time to Spokane. So we left that behind. We went into extensive counseling with our children. Our children all came out relatively healthy. They all turned their back on the church and said, "We can't believe you would still go to church." And the main reason that my husband and I go to church is that we need Eucharist. And we feel strongly that we didn't want to make the church even worse by leaving it. And so my question to you is there any hope in terms of our children and all these multitude of other children who feel like the church is basically built on a house of sand, and we don't really have an answer for them? So that's my question to you.
Well, first off, I just want to tell you, as a former part of the system, how deeply sorry I am for what you went through to be lied to and manipulated and treated and re-victimized that way. That is evil, period. Nothing else but evil. Be treated that way. And secondly, I would commend you for your honesty, your openness, and your bravery in standing up and discussing and exposing what has happened in your family. That's a more powerful message than anything I can say. What to do? We are the church, so we're the ones that have to, we got to stop depending on the clergy, on the bishops, on the priests for creating the Catholic community that we want to happen. We've got to create it. And we've got to be there to provide solace and love and support for other people who need it, like yourself or someone who's lost a loved one or anything along those lines. That can be done. That can be done. I've been in a deal like that for 28 years. And that's why it was founded. 2 drunks trying to help each other. And it spread. And so, you know, you can go to the Sunday Eucharist and take the Eucharist like so many people do who want to have Eucharist but don't want to buy into the whole program. And that's an honest response. And I don't blame you. And I applaud you. But you can have that, but the Christian community aspect or the community aspect is something we have to create, I think. It's not going to happen by itself. It is happening. And so when we say the church has done nothing for victims, they have. The church as people of God has a lot. And that's where the hope is. That's where the hope is.
Tom, thank you for being here tonight. As a retired Air Force chaplain, I appreciate the experience of ministry that you had, working with women and men of other denominations who were really committed to the service of people. The question comes about because while it doesn't appear there's going to be any significant change in admission policies to our seminaries, given the fact that we do have people in formation, what would you suggest as ways to make sure that, or to at least help them not drink the Kool-Aid and end up, because it's an institutional problem, but it comes down to a personal problem in terms of the individual priest or seminarian in formation. So what recommendations would you make to seminary formation?
That's another outstanding question, and that's a major problem, I think, in today's church, exactly what you're describing. And I don't have a good answer to that because that's not a part of the world that I've been involved in at all. But I believe very much in Catholic adults, because that's the scariest thing there is for a bishop is a Catholic adult. Not just a chronological adult, but the real deal. Confronting the issue head on. And making, enough stink, enough noise to really make them feel these people mean business. They're not going to tolerate this anymore, because that's the message that has to be gotten through. Laws and regulations and rules and all this sort of thing can only go so far. But I think meeting the problem head on, one-on-one, is one that may sound simplistic, but I think it's one way to do it. And not to be afraid. First thing we got to do is divest ourselves of all fear of the authority figures, whether they're the Pope, the Cardinal, the Bishop, or the Deacon. You got to shoot straight and say, this is where it is. You may have different clothes on than I do, but we're on a level playing field right now.
Our time is drawing down this evening, and so it's time to thank our Jesuit friends for hosting some appetizers and drinks outside. One of the things that occurs to me with these closing comments, and thanks to yourself, thank you very much for your statements. We have a new Jesuit colleague on campus who was loaned many years ago to Seattle University. His name is Father Pat Howell. He's come back to be with us, and I've had the opportunity to have several meetings with him around this issue. And in a very small way, but repeatedly, his approach has been to model a victim's first approach. Whatever we are discussing around the abuse phenomenon or crisis, it has to pass through that lens, that criterion of will it actually impact victim survivors. And so I hope that's of some use in particular to you. So thank you. Lastly, we have President Thane McCullough has put together a university commission around the Catholic sexual abuse crisis. And that commission is being organized by Dr. Michelle Wheatley and Dr. Megan McCabe as co-chairs, with a number of talented people behind them. My understanding is that sometime later this winter, they will be offering formal recommendations to the president concerning what our Catholic Jesuit University should be doing, ought to be doing in terms of offering an intellectual response that would be consistent with our university and consistent with Gonzaga's identity as a Jesuit Catholic institution. So I'm sure we will be informed in short order about those results. In February, we will be having our second Flannery speaker this year on this topic, Dr. Jennifer Bestie. Stay tuned for more information on her visit coming up in February. Please join me in thanking Dr. Thomas Doyle.